Our topic, operationalizing DPDP lesson for the financial sector ecosystem. As I call out the name of the speakers and moderator, I request you to please join me. Let's welcome them with a huge round of applause. Inviting, starting from Mr. Abhishek Bali, CEO and co-founder, ZIGRAM. Ms. Isha Oswal, Chief Executive Officer, JISA Software. Mr. Ranjan Reddy, founder, Bureau ID. Mr. Anand Raisinghani, CEO, Setu by Pine Labs. And to moderate this, I would like to invite Ms. Shalini Chakravorty, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, PhonePe. Thank you so much. Over to you.
All right. A very good afternoon to the audience and a very warm welcome. We have a very interesting topic that we are going to be discussing about today. How do we operationalize DPDP in such a ever-growing, booming fintech industry that we have today? So for decades, just setting up the context, for decades, financial sector has always been operating under the bedrocks of very stringent and trust mandating regulations. So to talk about KYC, AML, data localization, and so many, to talk about. And with that, we have the DPDP, which marks a very, unprecedented kind of a entry into the entire ecosystem. So are we looking at DPDP just as another, compliance layer on top of it? Or are we looking at it little differently? Because the way the act has been positioned, it is actually creating data as a personal fundamental right for every citizen. And beyond that, the customer actually becomes a true owner of the digital information. There is a lot of large data, public infrastructure available today, which is being leveraged by financial ecosystem, especially in the booming fintech industry, so to say, like UPI, account aggregator. So the question is not about how do we only comply with it. The question is about how do we operationalize DPDP as a strategic catalyst. We have to think of looking at beyond, just as a defensive compliance, rather than looking at this as a business driver, creating customer trust, making it very seamless, building trust, and of course, all of this leading to the growth of the organization. So to unbox all of these challenges and looking at where the opportunity really lies, we have gathered a very esteemed, panel, and they're going to be setting up, the strategic direction for this. So please join me in welcoming our panelist group here. So to begin with, I'll ask each one of them actually, at this point in time as a moment when DPDP is around the corner, we already have the act that has been published and we have rules that are going to be notified soon. So at this moment in time, how their organization is looking at DPDP, is it just a compliance hurdle or they are looking at it as an enabler to create a competitive advantage for their organization? And we can start with Anand.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I know we are between you and lunch. We'll try and keep this as satiating as possible. Look, thank you for setting us off. Largely, if we look at the biggest rails in the country today, and all the platforms that have reached a certain level of scale, I genuinely believe trust is an integral part of any of these platforms. If we're talking about consumers, their data, again, using the same template, every single rail or every single act that comes into play needs to maintain that level of integrity, which is built into the way the product actually goes out and gets consumed. I know most of you would have heard over the last 3 days and maybe even leading up to this event of how UPI has transformed the country. But I think one of the core aspects of UPI, beyond being just convenient, it also has trust baked into it. You've got the regulator giving consumers that level of confidence that this is something that has zero liability onto you in the terms of fraud or risk. And I think if you approach it from that level, that's the only way you're going to be able to reach scale, which is at the nation level. Otherwise, these are again going to be platforms that do not achieve the outcome while keeping the consumer at the center of what you want to achieve. So in my view, I think the template is very, very evident for us. All large scale platforms have actually kept trust at the center of what is achieved. So to me, I don't think this is a negotiable. Yeah.
Thanks. Ranjan, can I request you, please?
Thank you. I think on DPDP, the first thing I would say is it's about time. I think we are a little bit in India somewhat late. Our growth is definitely outpacing the need for these sort of laws or regulations coming in. I think a couple of things which are important is how would we judge the success of it, right? And from my point of view, is a lot of our data is already out there, right? So it's coming into different Telegram groups or wherever that is. Will that stop happening, or will that reduce dramatically? And one is that we have laws, but the second is the enforcement of it, right? So the fact that, Anand touched upon fraud and risk essentially. Why does that happen? Because it all starts with our data, right? How is that data getting out there? Why is it getting out there? How is this regulation going to actually arrest that a little bit, right? And then there are multiple stakeholders, right, who are either enablers of it or enforcers of it, right? How will that sort of play out? I think so that will be an important element in terms of, especially for somebody who's in the private sector and trying to be the custodian of bringing innovation in the space. That is where it comes down to that. What are some things that we want to do, and how will we sort of enforce the data that we receive and that the data we process? Some things will have to be told to us by way of the law, but not everything needs to be told to us by the letter of the law, right? There's some things that we have to sort of bring in terms of a certain mindset and enforcement of it. So simple things like, when we go to a restaurant or anybody, right, they always ask you for a number and sometimes more and all of that, right? That is the simplest point where data starts to go out from. And that's a very benign and sort of a basic example, but there's so many different ways that, our data sort of goes out there. And personally, I don't like it, especially in my, what I usually do is I usually give the wrong information, right? But that also comes back to bite you sometimes, right? Because somebody's profiling you in the wrong way then. But yeah, that's sort of the short comment.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. So, precisely when we talked about, talking about the act, whether it's been seen as a burden or how we are looking at data, as Ranjan rightly mentioned, I think we are a bit late because it's not something very new to everybody. There's been GDPR and a lot of other acts which are already focusing on it, who are already talking about it. And I'm sure lots of organizations have been already implementing this. So it's just about getting deeper into it, because definitely DPDP talks a much more beyond what people have been already doing, and it's focusing a lot on data fiduciaries, data principals, and everybody. So it's just the coverage has been increased, and I think penalties or compliances or the pressure or a burden is absolutely not there. It's only when you look at it from that perspective. But it's more to do with where the awareness is already there, I feel, with GDPR and other laws. But it's more of implementation, more of execution. And when you do it, there's nothing about the burden of compliances. I think that's something which everybody probably is looking forward to having it in place and seeing their benefits. It's all the more important to have it. And I'm sure organizations are already getting prepared for it. So I don't see it as a burden.
Yeah. I think, Isha, you very pointedly write it out. And financial sector is very highly regulated. There have been, DPDP has come in now, but there have been a lot of other circulars, by every regulator, which have been already directing the financial sector in terms of how the data should be handled within. Obviously, there is a larger need for creating an awareness, like Ranjan really mentioned. But Abhishek, we would love to hear your views as well.
Um, if we keep aside some of the more progressive organizations in India, for most organizations, my view is they will look at DPTV as a cost. I don't think many people are very enthusiastic about it right now. Not one, there are a couple of reasons why. One is no institution willingly looks forward to being regulated by an external body. It's very natural. The reason why we have regulations is because you want it for the greater good, something that will not come from within an organization. So there is already a lot of, I'd say, resistance to it, and businesses are going to look at it as a cost item, just like they do other compliances. That's, I think, one reality in India, and the reason why it is a reality is because of two reasons, in my opinion. One is our margins in India are very thin. Per customer, per transaction, we make very small margins in this country. You add another compliance layer on top, it's another additional cost. So people will have to figure out how will they deal with it. Now, compliance has to be done, but it'll have to be very cost effective. Otherwise, they won't do it. Number one, just like we've seen with AML, we've seen with fraud, we've seen a whole bunch of things. It takes a long time. Number one. The second is also enforcement. If number one, the education isn't there, and number two, the enforcement isn't there. If people don't end up getting pulled up for non-compliance, there are not enough fines or actions. Again, you'll probably see, with the exception of the top layer of the more progressive financial institutions in this country, everybody else may be taking a slightly more rational or slightly more ambivalent approach to it, is my opinion.
All right. Like I mentioned, financial sector obviously is regulated. I think you're looking at larger, ecosystem beyond financial sector as well in terms of how it is being looked at. But just adding, one point of view here, and most of the times organizations look compliance as a cost. However, I've always put this as a sustainable competitive advantage that you build if you are compliant. I think that's been proven multiple times over the years, not just in India, in fact, globally as well. And that's the narrative, if organizations look at it in terms of what it brings to the table from a long-term perspective, that really helps. Moving on to some specific discussions and questions of interest. DPDP is all about consent. If you really see, it's about consent and the privacy notice. There have been certain consent that's already been placed, like we mentioned that there have been certain circulars, regulations around it. But with the DPDP arrival, how are we looking at or rethinking building our consent management process, making it trustworthy to the customer? I think that's at the core. Making it very user-friendly, because you want to have more and more customers, and actionable. And that's a question I have for Anand.
Right. Before I get into that, I'm actually going to disagree with you, Abhishek, on what you just said, right? So let's take the example, and I know you can say this isn't a regulated industry, but let's look at Amazon, for example, right? When they decided to put up reviews as sellers, right? There was a big debate, right? Are you going to allow people to pass on comments that may not be in the best light? They may show up your product and its deficiencies, or are they also going to be allowed to say what truly their experience has been? I think today that's one of the most looked at sections on Amazon when each one of us goes and buys things, right? I mean, it's fairly clear when you put yourself out there and say, I'm here to serve somebody in the best intentions, then you've got to be able to take the good with the bad, right? And I think that's a perfect example of how you actually build trust. I see that actually very closely with the way Apple does things as well, right? You're fairly clear that for whatever it's worth, when you buy an Apple product, you signal privacy, you signal trust. And the reason I'm saying this is I don't think this is an afterthought, right? You're absolutely right. There will be some people who will say, let's just fly below the radar. Let's just get whatever needs to get done from the basic minimum. But I think if there are organizations that are looking to enmesh this into the core product, in the core design philosophy, then I genuinely believe that this is exactly how you build the right moats, the right trust again with your consumers. Closer home, right? If you look at the closest that we have to consent frameworks, it's Account Aggregator, right? And part of that ecosystem, the organization that I represent, we are part of that ecosystem. And one of the things that I think is quite fascinating about it is that every time you use the ecosystem, you've got to be able to connect it to a purpose code. You've got to be able to tell the consumer why you're using the data, what is the purpose of the data, how long am I going to take the data, when will I forget the data. Sure, does this mean that there will be some people who drop off? Absolutely. We see this. We see this day in and day out when we go through the funnel conversion. 100 people come in on one side, the other end you get about 60 or 70 people. So there is a drop off. But at least the folks who come in onto the network are very clear, why is my data being consumed, for what purpose it's being consumed. And I think that again goes to engendering trust. To me, I think these are things that need to get baked into the core philosophy of how we operate. Sure, we could be late, but I genuinely believe these are, I would look at this more as maybe a seatbelt while driving a car rather than, a pothole in the road that sets you or veers you off. So again, for me, it's embedded into the design of how you're operating versus treating this as a compliance cost. Because if you're not doing it, I can assure you at least 5 others will be doing it. Right? So that's just my point of view.
Thanks, Anand. And I think if you look at the act as well, it's really centered, like I said, around consent and giving notices to the customers. To that point, trust is at the core, right? Where you have to tell the customer this is what you're going to be using the data for, let's say, within the organization. And if the customer is agreeing to it, they know that the consequences, maybe they are going to get a lot of benefits out of it. So that's transparency. If you are able to build, of course, this will become a biggest advantage for any organization. Just moving on from the trust side, Abhishek, since you spoke about it, what do you think are the biggest, trust deficits or fixes that are required to meet the spirit of the DPDP Act from the customer's point of view?
Operationally, I'll say what comes to my mind is, number one is most organizations don't have a single customer view. So they don't have their data in one place or a complete view of the customer. So if I don't have one complete view of the customer and my data is not sitting in one place, I don't know where all it's sitting. So I don't even know how to protect it. This is a problem that we see across financial institutions, where it's in silos. The marketing team has its own data, the finance team has its own data. Everybody's very protective of their sort of little fiefdoms of data, or what you call data dumps that they have. I think one is unification and one sort of warehousing of that data. It's not a very, for lack of better words, it's not a very sexy thing to say, but that's the starting point. You have one place where your data sits. You've got 360-degree view of your customer, and only then can you start applying unified principles on top of them. So operationally, I think that's one challenge. Number two is, in most organizations, there is no one purveyor, surveyor, and controller of data. In most places, it's with some IT team, engineering team, finance team, somebody else sort of controls the data. And so that becomes a real problem. So there is no one person who's sitting there. The chief data officer as a concept is still very much an enterprise thought process and not there for the others. So I think that operationally, I'd say is number two is there. And I'd say third is just, just good old fashioned tone at the top. That's it. I mean, there are a lot of people out there, for example, when we have conversations, we see a full room like this. A lot of people are educated to a certain extent about the need for DPDP and for data privacy. But sometimes there are so many competing priorities at the top that it doesn't get pushed out. So I'd say operationally, these two would be the 2-3 things that would just sort of come to mind.
I think these are good points and somebody to really think through in terms of how they want to structure, the entire data journey. It's a journey that you start when you start to collect the data and until, you purge the data. So, having to collect the data, process the data, and then store the data until you purge. So it's a good journey to look at how you manage that entire life cycle of the data within the organization. It's about personal data that we are talking about today. Again, picking up from what Anand said, that we already have a good consent management in place through the account aggregator. So my next question is for you, Ranjan. There's already an infrastructure. There's already, a lot of flows that are existing within our ecosystem, within the financial services sector. How do you think financial sector, especially fintechs, can leverage what is existing within the organization from the point of view of managing risk, detecting fraud, and obviously making it very seamless for the customer?
Yeah, I think it sort of also brings in the earlier point Abhishek was mentioning about is this just a compliance? Is it a cost? Because to me, it's about the mindset. Because one can, like as fintechs or anybody in the financial services economy specifically, one can basically do this from the point that, okay, I'm being asked to do. So this is just a compliance cost maybe. Um, but it's about the mindset, right? That what am I actually going to gain out of it, right? Something to make it a little more tangible, right? For example, today when I order something on a D2C e-commerce website, or maybe I order food on a food delivery app or any of the ride-sharing apps, I do something. I don't know whether it's them or whether it's the fulfillment platforms that they use, but somehow my data is ending up there. When I was ordering food or when I was ordering something on a website, the consent I was giving them was for that purpose. At what point did I give them consent for doing other things where they could retarget me for other stuff, right? The delivery platform should not have a consent of mine to then use my data for some other purpose, right? So similarly, again, that like Abhishek pointed out, certain progressive organizations, certain organizations who have both a big brand reputation and a big infrastructure to both protect and grow, I think those would be the easier ones, right? I think how does it percolate down, right? And especially it will percolate down as long as they don't see it as a cost. They see it as that this is an enabler and not just the cost of doing business. And yes, there will be these unit economics challenges because the fulfillment platform is out there selling my data because they need to make an additional buck because the core business is not generating enough. So for me, I think it starts with the mindset that you're doing it because how do you think about that this is good for my business as opposed to cost of doing business? Uh, that is the primary shift that I would prefer to see. Yeah.
Thanks, Ranjan. We are talking about the ecosystem, the players. And my next question is to you, Isha. And where, there's a lot of interoperability that we are seeing, among different players that we have in the industry today. So what do you think that, what kind of a collaboration across the industry wide that can be brought together to ensure a seamless, secure, and privacy preserving data exchange between banks, fintechs, and other players that are supporting these two larger ecosystems? So, what do you think that we can bring in together without really fragmenting the customer experience?
Okay, interoperability. I think that's most critical today. I'm sure as an individual, we are also concerned about how my data is flowing, how it's being handled, whether I have a control over the data which I'm sharing. So interoperability actually serves like a backbone for overall, our digital economy, or which is growing exponentially. And if without this presence, we've seen a lot of banks or fintechs, or for that matter ecosystem partners, they would be developing solutions which are siloed in nature, which is going to bring in a lot of confusion, and trust factor is going to be at a question, because we've been talking about or hearing from Anand and everybody that it's all about trust. What we're trying to bring in is trust. So while doing it, more fundamental thing I would like to highlight is basically interoperability would not be just a technical standard or an API, something like that. It's more about building trust through data protection. So while there is an exchange of data happening between different platforms or various platforms, it could be between fintechs, banks, or third-party service providers. What's more critical is while this data is getting exchanged, I think there is an industry collaboration which is required, which is very essential in order to ensure that customer or an individual sharing data has the confidence that my data is secure. Maybe there could be certain practices like privacy by design, which is very critical. So when you are actually designing your product or any services or any transactional journey, privacy by design is going to play a very important role. Or we come together and agree to certain common data protection practices like DPDP Act, which is coming up. So definitely that serves as a purpose where people would start thinking in one single direction to ensure that the data exchange happens seamlessly. And in order to give this seamless or a secure experience to customer, few things which can be worked together, I suggest, I feel the consent management we talked about. So there has to be an interoperability between consent management platforms while exchange of data is happening or data is traveling through. And we probably can use privacy enhancing technologies like encryption, tokenization, or there are much more ways available where data can be secured. So once your data is secure and it travels through various channels, using this technology, if you have secured the data, I think customer will have this trust and they will be confident that irrespective of where my data is flowing, it's secure, and they have the confidence that it's not being misused. So which is very critical, and in order to make this happen, I think industry, fintechs, banks, or regulators and probably CEOs like us, we need to come together and maybe interact more with these regulators, bring, carry that the perspective of industry back to the regulators, because they also think from a perspective where they want to have a security at every layer, starting from a design stage or you go to execution everywhere. But they come from a regulatory perspective, and people, as we talked about, see from a compliance point of view. So more than a compliance, I think it's a value or it's the responsibility of every organization to bring in to secure their customer data or every citizen's data. And also go back and talk to them about the real-time challenges, because I think we talked about a lot of challenges, whether it's cost, whether it's execution, actual implementation. So this interoperability, if we consider data protection as a fundamental basic for practicing interoperability, I think that's going to make customers' experience absolutely seamless, is what I feel.
Yeah, thanks, Isha. I think that was good to look at. There's a challenge at an organization level, and of course, how at an industry level we can come together, look at what is a common challenge across, and collaborate to see. And I think, Abhishek, that would also address, it's not just being pioneered by the leaders within the industry. It can be taken up by, the smaller organization or smaller players where everyone adopts to it. End of the day, I think we just go back to the same principle of creating the customer trust, where they're sharing their personal information. And Ranjan, you mentioned about I gave wrong information just to avoid, but that circles back to you. So I think that's not a good strategy sort of to look at. So I think if we can build the trust with the customer, right, they will be more than happy to share when they know that this is the purpose I'm sharing the data for, and this is what it is going to be used for. The customer will not relook or reconsider while they're filling up any form or providing their information. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I want to just give a couple of examples that came to mind.
Sure.
About a decade or so ago, I had a little bit of an exposure of implementing a solution at Apple. They were a customer of mine in a different capacity. Until then, I thought this whole privacy piece is just a marketing spiel. But one thing that I learned there was that the Apple Financial Services, Apple Media Services, they had like 4 different services essentially. And they were very particular about that even amongst them, they don't share that data. They only identify it behind an Apple ID. So the sole principle that if I'm applying for Apple Card, doesn't mean I applied for something on the Apple App Store. So how do you sort of like from just again like the architecture point, how does an organization think about it? That was one. And second, in terms of just at that industry level, what Isha was talking about, there are, like again, we don't have to look too far. There are some of these things, I won't say these are solved problems, but people have at least shown us the way. So whether it's a banking industry level, whether it's in insurance or in e-commerce, right? There are these industry level consortiums which exist in different markets around the world. And I think a lot of that is starting to happen here, right? So I think some lot of good work that whether NPCI in their capacity or RBIH in their capacity are starting to bring. So that is fairly exciting to see that how all of these things that we are talking about, one is that our individual responsibility as an organization or as an individual, but how does it sort of, this will get, like I said, will it be successful and how will it be successful? That will have to be a bigger push from an ecosystem point of view, which is good to see that is happening.
I'll
Do you
just
think?
add on, sorry.
Please
So
go
this
ahead.
is, I think, since Ranjan just mentioned about the industry collaboration and a lot of things which are happening, I think this is one of the platform where we see FCC and PCI, they are coming up with a lot of new committees, and AI is recently been launched, right, with this current year. So I think this is one another thing, I think, Harshali, you can pass on this, that this is one more thing around DPDP, which I think even people sitting here on this dais as well as from audience would be definitely interested in contributing and identifying the areas where we can represent even something around DPDP and make it more adaptable so that people don't see it as a cost, but there is adaptability and ease of adopting to the act and implementing it. So that's definitely going to help.
Sure. Thanks, Isha. We just wanted to, I know it's a topic of a lot of interest, and since this is a new act, everyone is looking at, specific strategic advices and looking for direction. But we thought it would be nice if audiences have any questions. We would like to open this up and see if you have any questions for our panelists here. Can we have the mic, please?
Hi, thanks. Parag from Bureau. I think Ranjan mentioned DPDP is arriving late, and Anand mentioned on the consent piece. I think DPDP still doesn't answer. On the consent side, we are still living in a static binary one-time consent world, whether it is Facebook consent, WhatsApp consent, any example you see. With AI coming in, I think the need of the hour is a contextual, continuous, transparent consent from the customer, which DPDP, I think, still doesn't answer. So that's still trading in between and not adapting to the AI world. Any thoughts on that?
Not very sure if it relates specifically. Yes, DPDP doesn't talk about AI as such, but I think overall it's
Not
or a
AI,
consent on a
consent.
specifically on a consent base. But I think they have come up with an additional annexure specifically on the consent management, its rules and everything. And I'm sure if we read it in a right fashion, we should be able to figure out something out of that, even for the AI related activities. But I think Anand has something to add on.
No, so you're right about the fact that has has this clearly defined exactly how this will get operationalized? The answer is no. Um Again, is it a step in the right direction? I think yes, it will move in that space. If I have to just give you a parallel to what's happening with the consent space, again, I'm going to go back to the account aggregator framework because that's been around for the last 2, 3 years now. It's very specific. You have to be able to tell the consumer purpose codes, and these are predefined purpose codes. How often you can get the data, for what duration you will get the data, in what form the data will be saved and stored. The interesting part that's also happening now is that, and I won't name names here, but the onus of doing this was always left to the FIU, which is essentially the user organization. But there are even technology service providers who've said, hey, listen, even if I'm passing on the pipe to you and I'm building the infrastructure, we're going to put those guardrails at our end so that the information that gets consumed by you is consumed in a compliant manner. Clearly, that would mean that you're doing more than you're supposed to do. But I will also tell you that there are these technical service providers who've created this level of trust by saying, even though it's not my fiduciary responsibility to deliver this outcome, I will still do it. Right? Now, you may choose not to work with me because I'm doing something that is not my remit. But I think over a period of time, this itself sets you up to set yourself up in a position to say, hey, you're doing this from a position of compliance, and you're also doing it from a position of saying, you understand how this needs to get implemented. So it works both ways, right? And it's easy enough for you to also see in the industry how the regulator has come down very heavily on FIUs who have misused this. So yes, I think there is a long way to go. But look, let's face it, yeah. Nation building is a long and an arduous journey, right? We've started somewhere. There'll always be enough to do. So in my view, I think, yeah, I'll always look at it as glass more than half full versus half empty. Yeah.
Sure. That's what I meant. Consent and trust goes hand in hand.
We have a question at end.
Hi, good afternoon, panel. My question is basically, like one of you mentioned, right? We have a terms and condition in place. Generally, the expectation is that a user, when they are consenting to the TNC, they're basically saying yes to the data that we are taking. But in companies, the TNCs, they do take the consent, but ultimately the customer doesn't really know which all companies or which all places their data is going to get shared. They just have a very generic statement saying that your data will be shared with other third parties for whatever reasons. So now that is technically legal, however not that transparent to any normal customers, normal users who are not basically going to get into the intricacies of legalities of the TNCs, etc. So how do we reconcile the satisfaction of, okay, technically we are doing everything legal versus it is not that transparent to a customer?
I'll try and respond to that. When we think of data, we think of it as an interaction between two parties, me, the customer, and you, the service provider. But really, you have to think of it like any piece of material or any goods that you're buying. It has to go through an entire supply chain, right? There are raw material providers, there are logistics providers, there are maybe 100 people who will touch an item before it is finally delivered to you. Data behaves in exactly the same fashion, in the sense that while data itself, your personal data may not change, what happens with it changes as it goes through the entire supply chain. So I think the right way to look at it is that the principal or the anchor organization of the supply chain has to ensure that their supply chain is committed to the same principles of privacy as they themselves are. This is the exact same way, say, an organization, a large organization like Walmart or Boeing or Airbus also behaves. Airbus can't come tomorrow and say, hey, I'm sorry, my plane's not working because Hitachi did something wrong. They have to make sure that they are taking the complete onus. So I think one of the ways that we will enable that is not by necessarily burdening the user by telling them, hey, I've got these 100 partners, you've got to sign up for all of them, but is to be able to commit that my entire supply chain of data adheres to the same principles. And I think when it comes to the DPDP Act, it has moved in that direction, but I think there is going to be far more work done in that direction to be able to secure something that you've spoken about right now. That's my view.
We can take one more question if we have any audience who's interested to. Okay, all right, let's go ahead. So we'll, a question that I have for Isha and Anand. In one sentence, if you would, need to give a strategic advice to, the startup in the fintech specifically, who are starting their DPDP journey, what would be that?
I think I'm going to go with what Abhishek said and simply, put it into the code, not the fine print, right? It's got to be in your code. If that's the principle with which you're going to operate, then that's exactly how this is going to play out. So that's my one simple sentence.
Yeah, I think Anand has successfully put it in a single sentence, which I may not be able to do. But then just, it'll be more on the operational side. I think I can just add on, is basically one of the things which I had mentioned is privacy by design. Because DPDP talks a lot about even DPI. Any new product you launch, any new process you start with, everything calls for a audit and assessment, I would say precisely. So in order to make sure you don't have to go back and start doing things from scratch, I think you just go by a principle of privacy by design or protection by design. So when you are starting your journey, I think it's good to start from what is needed and make your system, I will flexible enough to adopt to it as and when you grow. That's what I would say.
Thanks, Isha. And I have question both for Ranjan and Abhishek. What are the most significant operational challenges, tech, governance, or culture, that can drive up the cost of compliance? And what are the strategic for the cost-efficient implementation, DPDP implementation?
I think one, like again, there are tags that we put, right? This is compliance, this is for fraud prevention, or this is for security, or any of that. But the underlying subtext that everybody's talking about is essentially trust. So whether it's privacy by design, but why are you doing it? Because you want to at least show trust, right? Are you delivering trust? That's the second part, right? And that is where I think I would say more on the governance and the culture part. I think, and governance usually is as good or as bad as the consequences it is dealt with. So, it would be good if there were some real consequences, to the point that Abhishek had mentioned, I think, earlier in the conversation. So governance will improve only when these things are enforced by the authorities. I mean, let's be clear, for DPDP, we are all consumers in this room, right? We're not the creators of it. And the creators will also have to figure out how to enforce it to see results there. And the second is the culture piece, which I touched upon earlier, that it's really a mindset issue, right? Where you're not looking at just a short-term data trading or a data enhancement or data enrichment. Those are fairly transactional way of looking at things. Is there something which sort of goes beyond that and compounds? That we'll all actually will have that challenge to think about, right? Because today there's a certain way of how we have been conditioned, right? That unconditioning will take time, and that is where that culture shift we'll all have to make. So.
The way that we envision this is that every organization practically will need to build 3 layers. One is data warehousing, where all customer data can sit one single place, federated, but one single place that can be managed centrally. Number 2 is going to be the processing layer, to make sure the data is getting processed and why it is getting processed and what is it getting processed for. That's the second layer. And third is then the consent layer. So consent and governance layer. Often we only talk about consent and governance, but I think the really difficult part, as I mentioned earlier, was trying to get all the data in one place, structured, validated, verified, and then have it processed. I think that's where a lot of the capex and investment is going to go in for organizations who want to comply.
Thank you so much to all the panelists and the audience. It's a good journey to begin with. We all know that it doesn't really answer all our questions or provide all our clarity. But I think collaboratively we can all come together and make sure that we create enough awareness, we provide complete transparency, and we build the trust with the customer. I think that's where it all comes down to in the end. But I want to thank my panelists for providing such insightful strategic direction to the audience here, and audience for being patient and asking some really relevant questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. A heartfelt thank you to our moderator, speaker. Let's take a picture. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with us. With this, we conclude our session as we wrap up Global Fintech Fest 2025. A heartfelt thank you to our speaker, partner, sponsor, and most importantly, all of you for making these 3 days such an inspiring celebration of ideas.